And I wanted to introduce our speakers today. We have three excellent papers. The first one is going to be by Franca Dellarosa, Frankenstein and the Perplexities of the Rights of Man. Franca Dellarosa is at the University of Bari, and she is the author of Talking Revolution, Edward Rushton's Rebellious Politics, as well as Slavery on Stage. Our next presenter will be Mary Jacobus. Oh, do you want to go and go? Yes.
I've got
So-
that.
So I'll just finish the introductions, and then you can switch the order as you want. Will be Mary Jacobus from the English department at the University of Cambridge, talking about translating Inhospitality, migration, monstrosity, and the other. And our final speaker will be Marina Calloni. Marina Calloni is a member of the University of Milano-Bicocca. And Marina is a professor of social and political philosophy, and she works on projects that are linked to the UN, the European Union. She's co-authored EU reports on women scientists in post-socialist countries, something very interesting to me, and the role of science in society in general. She will be presenting a paper on protecting unaccompanied minors. These are going to be 3 papers, 20 minutes each, and then we will have a 30-minute discussion for the audience. So without further ado, I wanted to invite Mary.
I'm very, very anxious about my DVD playing, so I've been trying to negotiate an American DVD of an Italian film in an Italian market. So excuse me for continuing to go first. So this is the here and now part of the conference. I just want to thank the organizers for a really incredibly interesting way of thinking with Frankenstein. And I'll start with a little bit of inane reverence, phrase used by Rubeck, quoted yesterday to us. 20 years ago, in response to an earlier immigration crisis, Derrida linked the etymology of hospitality with the Latin word hostis, as I'm sure you know, enemy, adversary, stranger. Immanuel Kant's twin concepts in perpetual peace, world citizenship and universal hospitality, extend the stranger's rights beyond mere philanthropy. Hospitality, according to Kant, means, quote, the right of a stranger not to be treated as an enemy when he arrives in the land of another. He defines the stranger's right as a universal right of association by virtue of the need for tolerance in a world of finite resources where infinite dispersal is no longer possible. Universal hospitality as a purely ethical stance jostles with the legal right to reside. The conceptual oscillation still troubles today's unprecedented migration crisis. Is the, quote, right to asylum an ethical obligation or one based on international law? Is it universal or restricted? Derrida's 1997 on cosmopolitanism turns on the contradictory imperative confronting us today, the absolute duty, the devoir, of hospitality versus the limited right, droit, to reside. Seeking asylum has never been easy. Already in 1997, Derrida could observe asylum seekers knock successively on each of the doors of the European Union states and end up being repelled at each one of them. Today, we have the UK's hostile environment for immigration. In the US, zero tolerance for illegal immigrants and the weaponization of children. And of course, in Italy, the plan to deport 500,000 illegal migrants and a zero landing Mediterranean for migrants rescued at sea. In other words, the normalization of the previously unthinkable or condemned. Linking hospitality with ethics itself, with culture itself, Derrida makes ethos, that is one's residence, home, or one's dwelling place, coextensive with hospitality, inasmuch, he writes, inasmuch as it is the manner in which we relate to ourselves and to others as our own, or as foreigners, ethics is hospitality. Yet, alongside this ethos of radical inclusion, there exists a contrary impulse to appropriate, master, and expel. Derrida reminds us that Kant's formulation of the law of universal hospitality already contained a fundamental antinomy between the right to reside versus the sovereignty of the state. The problem is to identify a space for negotiation between the unconditional law of hospitality and the conditional right to asylum, a potential site of transformation or compromise. Claiming refugee status confronts ideas about law and the state. The concept of unconditional hospitality and the conditional laws of asylum remain a source of immense tension within Western democracies. Witness Trump's criminalization of asylum seekers and the EU's militarization of its external and increasingly internal boundaries. In his another text of hospitality, Derrida extends the debate about the so-called foreigner question to language. The foreigner, inept at speaking the language, always risks being without defense before the law of the country that welcomes or expels him or her. Translation is the rite de passage set in motion by the stranger's request for asylum. The asylum seeker has to plead for legal status in the language of the host state. Derrida writes, the foreigner is first of all foreign to the legal language in which the duty of hospitality is formulated, the right to asylum, its limits, norms, policing, etc. Without papers, family, or social identity, the anonymous asylum seeker is a radical outsider to the juridical system. On one hand, writes Derrida, absolute hospitality requires that I open up my home, that I give not only to the foreigner, provided with a family name, with the social status of being a foreigner, etc., but to the absolute, unknown, anonymous other, without asking of them either reciprocity, entering into a pact, or even their names. On the other hand, juridical requirements for obtaining the legal right to reside subjects the anonymous other to routine questioning. What is your name? Who are you? Where do you come from? What do you want? Asylum seekers have to come up with a coherent story, names, origins, dates and places, evidence of persecution. Derrida redefines the foreigner in this context as the completely other, relegated to an absolute outside, quote, a savage, barbaric, pre-cultural and pre-juridical outside, prior to the family, the community, the city, the nation, or the state. This barbaric, pre-cultural being without name or family can only be monstrous. In order to be recognized, the migrant must submit to the dominant legal and linguistic order. Translation imposes juridical norms, supposedly producing a disciplined and grateful migrant. But the process is always incomplete. The other, as stranger, enemy, reappears as the incompletely assimilated alien who haunts the periphery, indeed the peripheria, of the privileged state of belonging. The figure of the migrant returns, like Frankenstein's nameless being, in the guise of the pre-cultural or criminalized, completely other, monstrous, untranslatable, and menacing. Mary Shelley's savage other disturbs both philanthropic and juridical ideas about hospitality, with a demand for recognition that exceeds Kant's language of Enlightenment reason, posing a threat to Enlightenment itself and even to ethical normativity. You might say, testing these ideas to destruction. Okay, turning to Frankenstein. Shelley's Frankenstein poses its question in the form of a monstrous pre-linguistic being created out of dissected body parts. The being has no family, no name, and its origins are obscure. Shelley's inhuman, if you want, post-human, and we heard this morning, deeply human, creature pleads for acceptance on the humanistic basis of an innate capacity for love and benevolence, or as we should say, relationship and sociality. But the savage other is doomed to rejection, embodying the most repugnant elements of humanity, physically abject, morally degenerate, malignantly destructive. He inspires only horror. He requires for his transformation the satisfaction of recognition, the right to be, the being. His bottom line demand is for a mate, as you know. What I ask of you is reasonable and moderate. His demand provokes Frankenstein's Malthusian fear that the nightmare family might overrun the human race. Deprived of sociality, the being turns to murder and revenge, and by the end of the novel, both monster and maker are outcasts at the limits of the frozen world. Frankenstein and the being are bound to each other, like Hegel's master and slave, as Alan Coffey talked about earlier. Each is the creature of the other, or in Fanon's account of the colonial subject, the fixity of their relation is defined in optical terms. Fanon writes, "I am being dissected under white eyes, the only real eyes. I am fixed." Walton first encounters Frankenstein in exhausted pursuit of his monstrous alter ego. In the fleeing figure of the being on his ice sledge, Walton sees only a savage inhabitant of some undiscovered island. By contrast, he immediately recognizes Frankenstein as European and gives them a sympathetic ear. Earlier in the novel, the being experiences the first of many rejections, as we've heard, when he throws himself on the mercy of the De Lacy household. Could they turn from their door one, however monstrous, who solicited their compassion and friendship? He asks. Well, yes, they could. As the being tells Frankenstein, all men hate the wretched. How must I then be hated, who am miserable beyond all living things? The being's hyperbolic wretchedness breaches the boundaries of sociality. Misery made me a fiend. Shelley's absolute outsider is fiendish because of his exclusion from the family of man. So the being demands as his impossible right no less than absolute hospitality. In the face of Frankenstein's refusal, there can be no community between you and me, we are enemies. The being recognizes their insurmountable hostility. Shall I not hate those who abhor me? I will keep no terms with my enemies. I am miserable, and they shall share my wretchedness. Now, wretchedness means literally the state of exile or banishment. It's from the Proto-German Rakion, pursuer, one pursued. Pleading his case, the being invokes the law. The guilty are allowed by human laws, bloody as they may be, to speak in their own defense before they're condemned. All he claims is the right to be heard. Hear my tale, it is long and strange, and so on. An enlightenment enfant sauvage, he's educated by the Deleuses, as you know, his unwitting host family, who expose him to a crash course in integration, language, literacy, translation, the history of empire, and civics, Godwinian, political injustice, and social inequality. His own lost history makes him a blot. He's not just monstrous, but illegible. Was I then a monster, a blot upon the earth from which all men fled and whom all men disowned? The blot, an unreadable blank, includes his origins. All my past life was but a blot, a blind vacancy in which I distinguished nothing. What was I? Rather than being cast out because he's criminal, he's criminalized because he lacks identity papers. The being's first victim is Frankenstein's little brother, William. And William's murder involves another encounter with the law, the case of Justine. And since you know so much about the monsters, the being's story, I'm going to segue to Justine's case. Justine's confession of guilt for little William's murder has often perplexed Shelley's readers and been seen as an apparent outlier to the novel's trajectory. As in the Irish episode, the being diabolically incriminates another person for a murder he has committed. We learn from the being that he incriminates Justine by slipping into her pocket the miniature portrait of William's and Frankenstein's dead mother, the miniature William wears around his neck. The portrait infuriates the motherless being who was ever deprived of the delights that such beautiful creatures could bestow. It provides a piece of circumstantial evidence that seals Justine's guilt. Her behavior on the night of William's murder is very suspicious and, for instance, asked what she was doing near the spot where William's body was later found. She, quote, only returned a confused and unintelligible answer. The incoherence and gaps in her story, combined with the discovery of the miniature, render her the chief suspect. Despite testimony to her life and her good character, Justine is found guilty and confesses to the murder. Why? Justine, who's a glutton for punishment, like her Sadian namesake, explains that her confession has been coerced by an overzealous priest who threatened her with excommunication and hellfire. He threatened and menaced until I almost began to think that I was the monster he said I was. And so I did confess, but I confessed a lie. I confessed that I might obtain absolution. Bullied into thinking of herself as a monster, Justine comes to resemble the being whose backstory of maternal deprivation she actually shares. If you remember, she's the third of 4 children. She'd been rejected by her own mother and later adopted by the Frankenstein family. Here she finds a substitute mother in Mrs. Frankenstein, but when Justine's remaining siblings die, her neglectful mother recalls her, believing that she's being punished for unkindness, yet somehow also that Justine is to blame. And then after nursing her mother to her deathbed, Justine returns to the Frankenstein family, where she assumes the role of substitute mother to the now motherless William. So much for the backstory, but I think it's worth noting that for Shelley, maternal rejection and maternal death are intimately intertwined. Well, that's impossible. I'll speed up. Justine's false confession can be read as the means to her rehabilitation. Once she confesses, she acquires a recognizable position within the discourse of sin and absolution. Now she's guilty indeed, if only of her lie. The falsehood, she says, lies heavier at my heart than all my other sins. In her 214 anthropological study called Migrants in Translation, Caring and the Logics of Difference in Contemporary Italy, Cristina Giordano argues that women migrants trafficked as sex workers must submit to a form of effacement in order to obtain legal papers. Subjected to juridical discourse, they have to repent of their employment as sex workers and denounce their traffickers. To effect the passage from illegal migrants to legal resident, the women's fragmented stories undergo conversion into polished narratives, translated, if you like, with the help of cultural mediators, using protocols shaped by the logic of Catholic confession. So, like Justine's confused alibi, the narratives of trafficked women, dates, places, names, and so on, stage an encounter with the illegibility of individual histories and judicial demands. Gaps and contradictions are ironed out in the so-called verbale or denuncia that provides the basis for filing criminal charges against the trafficker. The police officer explains to the trafficked woman that she is there, quote, to tell her true story of how she was brought to Italy. She had to tell him her real name, the date and place of her birth, the exact events concerning her travel to Italy, and her involvement in prostitution. He warns her, providing false information would be punishable as a crime. She had to tell him nothing but the truth. Giordano observes that the story produced in filing criminal charges uncannily resembles the process of religious confession. In a denuncia, the woman tells her story in order to be admitted into the legal domain of society. And she concludes, redemption and expiation are integral to state integrationist policies. I just want to note that Giordano points out that in the ethno-psychiatric care given to trafficked women in the Clinic Fanon in Turin, the psychiatrists allow the woman's own truth or life narrative, including voodoo, to coexist with psychiatric care. And I will skip over some more about this, but I think it's important to recall that Shelley's being poses to us his own unanswered question, am I to be thought the only criminal when all humankind sinned against me? Now I wanted just to segue to Rossi's documentary, Fuoco Amare, which juxtaposes the everyday lives of people on Lampedusa with the incoming migrants from Libya. And Rossi tells us how he wants to switch the point of view and tell the story of the migrants through the eyes of the people of Lampedusa. And in this film, there's a boy who becomes a center, Samuela, who is a kind of, he's sort of a Caliban. He has an eye problem. He has an eye patch. He spends a lot of time with a catapult shooting at either real or imaginary birds, traditional, now banned way of greeting migrant birds when they come ashore on the shores of Italy. And there's I haven't time to say more about this, but I think that there's a wonderful moment at the end when the boy, Samuela, who's also learning English, meets the doctor who has to do DNA tests on the washed up bodies of men, women, and children, and says it's the absolutely worst part of his job. He has to dissect them, take ears, fingers to get their DNA. It's very interesting. Bartolo is sort of the ethical center of the film, and he and the boy, Samuela, have a wonderful encounter where they both turn out to suffer from kind of psychosomatic experiences. In Samuel's case, a kind of asthma attacks, and in the case of the doctor, what he calls a hole in his gut. But at the very end of the film, there's a wonderful scene when Samuela, the little Caliban, a little monster in a way, turns into a kind of papageno, and you see him going out, instead of catapulting a bird, this is all about tweeting, he has a kind of interspecies dialogue with the bird. So, and I'll leave you with that.
Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot, Eileen and everybody, and really special thanks to the organizers of this really fantastic conference, which has been an experience of extraordinary exchange for all of us, I think. So, many echoes, many conversations going on, really. So, and the creature, indeed, is one who is having conversations. Hear my tale, the creature says, shutting for a moment Victor Frankenstein's horrified gaze with his gigantic hands. The language they share demarcates the domain and the very possibility of their confronting. That access to human communication, which the creature has harmlessly gained, unseen, via a vicarious education in from his marginal station in the world, a small and almost imperceptible chink in the wooden plank that separated him and his appropriately non-human place of refuge from a household and a world of science in which he did not belong. As many commentators have marked, like just a few names from Chris Boldick to Peter Brooks to Fred Botting, just to mention but a few, and as we have been discussing now for 3 days, language and the power it bestows on those who control it is certainly a key concern and a crucial battleground for the staging of the central conflict, which is both rendered individual and private, and ironically for that reason, powerfully political, as Adriana Cracciun has recently observed, taking up and expanding on Lee Sternberg's groundbreaking reading of the novel. Of the dense network of voices we encounter in the intricate dynamics of speaking and listening, but also writing, and virtual as well as real reading that shapes the narrative discourse, The Creatures resonates with the innermost echo, embedded for the most part in his maker's narrative, which in turn is conveyed by the English traveller listener to Sister Margaret Walton Saville, MWS of course, the diegetic intended reader and ultimate recipient of the entire communication. The Creature's eloquent voice carries the weight of the inarticulation to which he had appeared to be condemned at his awakening in the secret theatre of the scientist's room. The inarticulate, as E.B. Thompson reminds the reader in the fresco of the making of the English working class, leave few records of their thoughts. And after all, this is not the case with the Creature, who does give full, if ineffectual, voice to his claim for recognition. This is one major reason why I will be arguing Frankenstein at 200 is still very much speaking to us, particularly in the here and now of these dark days worldwide. In what follows, I offer some thoughts on the transhistorical significance of Mary Shelley's immensely complex narrative by reading it against Hannah Arendt's landmark pages in The Origins of Totalitarianism, devoted to interrogating the perplexities of the rights of man. In the final part of my presentation, I will also mention really in passing a possible further step for me to take in this work, which has to do with Giorgio Agamben's development of Arendt's argument in the context of his own discussion of the notion of bare life in his 1995 study, Homo Sacer, Sovereign Power and Bare Life. And so, let us go ahead. Okay, that should have come. Okay, that's it. So let's start with recognition, hospitality, and inclusion, which obviously, I mean, there are so many resonances, it's quite extraordinary. I am a traveller is the Creature's self-definition as offered to the only unprejudiced interlocutor he comes across in his hopeless wayfaring. Old Dellarosa, who, though blind, can see, like Tiresias in the far sermon section of The Wasteland. Old Dellarosa has indeed the negative gift deriving from his disability to be spared the invariable, literal misapprehension of the abject body of his transitory guest, and thus the positive one genuinely to experience the recognition of the guest's speaking voice as a synecdoche for a rightful part or member of the human community to which he himself belongs, even though from his own status as an exile, that is an individual who by definition inhabits a peripheral social space. The process of recognition, in turn, accounts for the old man's all-too-transient bestowal of the gift of hospitality, a key notion and practice in the rights of peoples since ancient times, as Arendt, and after her thinkers, I was just exactly thinking of Jacques Derrida and his discussion on cosmopolitanism, underscore. Recognition, inclusion, or conversely and more fittingly exclusion, belonging, hospitality. We find ourselves unmistakably located within the semantics and the existential and political paradigm of the stateless, the asylum seeker, the refugee, as quintessentially human, as rightless, Hannah Arendt argues. New interpretations positioning the novel in conversation with earlier political thinking and within Donning human rights discourse have opened up a new and inspirational critical path, which we have been enjoying, in fact, over these days. which is evidently not inconsistent but in permanent dialogue with the more extensive volume of scholarly work that over the last 20 or 25 years has fruitfully situated Frankenstein again within contemporary racial and colonial discourses, highlighting the various forms of reverberation of the creature's alienated status with colonial subjects. And obviously I'm thinking of the work of scholars such as Moro, Howard L. Chow with his important essay, Elizabeth Young, Elizabeth Bowles, Alan Lloyd-Smith, and still others, are summed up by Patrick Brandlinger in his chapter on race in the new Cambridge Companion on Frankenstein. As to the new track, I've obviously and primarily in mind Eileen and Botting's compelling and thought-provoking new books on Frankenstein and the rights of the child, and also some earlier contributions, and particularly in the light of his setting the novel against racial discourse, Eduardo Cadava's article on the monstrosity of human rights. A turning point in history, in Arendt's view, the great 18th century documents setting down the rights of man carry out a performative transformation in the focus of the source of law from God to man, only to reveal from the very beginning the intrinsic contradiction underlying that elaboration. From the beginning, the paradox involved in the declaration of inalienable human rights was that it reckoned with an abstract human being who seemed to exist nowhere, for even savages lived in some kind of social order. The assumed inalienability of the rights of man, in other words, was to prove tragically permeable against the test of history, that is, the impact of the historical conditions of their occurrence and presumed actualization. While social order is the domain of sovereignty as exercised by the nation state, the source of all sovereignty resides essentially in the nation, as Article 3 of the French Declaration reads. Citizenship, that is, the identification of the individual as integral in the community of the nation, and thus endowed with entitlements deriving from that recognition, becomes the necessary condition for his enjoyment of the assumedly natural rights. Arendt's intellectual elaboration on the essentially operatic quality of the rights of man finds its glaring historical evidence in the philosopher's discussion of the condition of statelessness, as experienced in Europe by hundreds of thousands of people in the aftermath of the two world wars. In that condition, according to Arendt, the incongruity entailed in the irreducible tension between the individual and the particular, the natural and the contingent, man and citizen, is literally made flesh. If a human being loses its political status, it should, according to implication of the inborn and inalienable rights of man, come under exactly the situation for which the declaration of such general rights provided. Actually, the opposite is the case. It seems that a man who is nothing but a man has lost the very qualities which make it possible for other people to treat him as a fellow man. The paradox is then exposed, whereby, according to Ian Balfour and Eduardo Cadava again, human rights do not precede political ones. Instead, political rights are what determine the recognition and definition of human rights. Arendt's argument, summed up in a harrowing formulation of the stateless condition as the abstract nakedness of being nothing but human, crucially questioned the notion itself of universal rights, which had been under scrutiny since the great 18th century documents. As Balfour and Cadava again observe, that the lofty discourses of inalienable rights, universal equality and liberty could be proffered by slaveholders such as Jefferson and Washington is a familiar perplexity, but one not less scandalous for its familiarity. To devise effective inclusion and universalities, it would take a politically visionary mind, such as, for instance, as follows. Pregnant with the purest political wisdom, you contributed in no small degree to emancipate the people of America from the proud domination of Britain, and you're called upon in the name of suffering humanity to aim at rescuing one part of that very American people from the abominable grasp of the other. This is Liverpool, labouring class, anti-slavery, anti-war, anti-imperialist, blind poet, and human rights campaigner Edward Rushton, at the beginning of the new century, addressing Thomas Paine to exhort him to intervene and raise a new and higher stake for the cause of liberty. Importantly, from our perspective, the passage envisions an inclusive notion of the nation's community, whereby the enslaved blacks are fully entitled to be part of the American people, and thus by implication, to enjoy all the rights and prerogatives attached to that condition. In short, what modern human rights documents and scholars would call the right to a life of dignity, which indeed, not even today, can be said to be granted to everyone, even within the increasingly impenetrable boundaries of citizenship, not to mention what happens without, whether in the United States or Italy or any other of our modern democracies. Arendt does make reference to slavery as a crime against humanity in its naturalizing a condition in which some men were born free and others slaves. That was a quote. And even though, in her view, quote, even slaves still belonged to some sort of human community, the labor was needed, used and exploited, and this kept them within the pale of humanity. This last point may well be debatable, at the very least. When set against historical evidence, as provided exemplarily by the St. Kitts Slave Register for 1817, recording a slave boy of 14 whose name was given as nobody. This was a very accurate description of his condition, since in law he had no rights or voice. He could not speak in court without a special leave being given, and as to his body, it belonged to his master. And here, for this historical detail and information, I credit my colleague and historian of the Caribbean, Alex Robinson in Liverpool. But we are getting a little off the point now. The key question we need to address is how all this heavy matter reverberates in the novel. And so, the abstract nakedness of being nothing but human again. So, all men hate the wretched is the creature's bitter remark when meeting his creator. How then I must be hated, who am miserable beyond all living things, yet you, my creator, detest and spurn me, thy creature. There are clear biblical echoes in these words, even though ironically reversed with respect to Christ's paradigm, where it is the creature that hates, detests, and spurns the creator. Not to mention, obviously, the further level of irony entailed in the creature's later self-identification as Satan, as Milton Satan. They appear to reinforce that Christ-like element about the creature that Elizabeth was mentioning as valorized in Wales' film. And the resonance here, I find, is Isaiah 53. He is despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. A man of sorrows the creature certainly is, whether or not his full humanity be recognized as such by those who have eyes, and for that reason they cannot see. The extraordinary pages in Volume 2, Chapter 4, focusing on the creature's process of language learning, convey his progressive discovery of communication through articulate sounds, the arbitrariness of the linguistic sign, and thus the unmistakably human potentiality for abstraction. And this is the passage that we all know. And that's there. So, if articulate language is the discriminating line for the recognition of full humanity, as it is, for instance, in Aristotle's conceptual transition from voice to language, from phone to logos, as the proper place of the polis, in Giorgio Agamben's word, that is, the place of articulate political life. If this is the case, then the paradox the creature leaves us with is his very liminal status, all too human, but outside the pale of humanity, to return to Arendt's language, outside the polis or the polity, exactly like the countless human beings excluded, again with Arendt, from the right to have rights, because of the abstract nakedness of their being nothing but human. I can hardly think of any more powerful and upsetting representation of that condition than that potent, upsetting canvas, which is Joseph William Mallard Turner's 1840, and that's it. The slavers throwing overboard the dead and dying, typhoon coming on, better known as the slave ship. Probably, though not exclusively, inspired by the 1781 episode of the song The Slaving Ship, with the jettisoning of 133 enslaved human beings, and inconclusive insurance litigation that followed. The lurid light of the hurricane approaching, yellow, orange, ochre, reddish-brown, dissolving the sky into the sea, which has the color of blood, hands and chains, legs, fish, seagulls, arms, the dismembered bodies of voiceless human beings lost at sea, but not because of the sea's violence. To us, this side of history and of the Mediterranean, the resonances are too familiar and ghastly to need any comment. From his dark, distant but all too close abode in the recesses of our culture, conjured up by a unique combination of cultural intelligence, imaginative power, and human suffering by an immensely talented young woman writer in extraordinary circumstances, the creature is forever speaking, and for that reason, opposing the mechanism of silencing the past, identified and resisted by Asian historian Micherov-Trouillot. The creature's voice and abject body is out there, still eliciting our understanding of the tragic dynamics of power and oppression, a commanding and woeful figure for each single member of the wretched of the earth. Thank you.
I'm very pleased to participate in this successful conference, and thank you very much, Eileen, Greg, and Augustine for organizing it. It is great, your creature. It took almost 3 years, but it's really very well organized. Thank you, Matt, for inviting me, and I had also the opportunity to teach at the University of Notre Dame, to be back now. So I'll talk about a specific issue related to migration, and that is also the issue of abandoned children. And so I will try to consider this issue from a normative and critical perspective in political philosophy, gender studies, and human rights. So I also refer in particular to the chapter 4 of the book by Eileen Handbatting, devoted to disabled, stateless, and post-human children. We discussed a lot in the past year. So my question is the following. What is the condition and what are the feelings that the children have when physically and emotionally deprived because they have been abandoned or they had to abandon their mother, family, due to different reasons? Their creature, created by Frankenstein, will function as an example able to represent different forms of abandoned children. I will mention 3 kinds of abandoned children. First, because of the lack of a mother. Second, because they were and still are left by the mother and or by the father due to cultural, socio-economic, or because illegitimate and disabled. Third case, because forced to leave their mother, father, family of origin, and in this case of present migration. Regarding this last example, in fact, I will refer to 2 dramatic cases occurred recently in the United States and in Italy, also in different ways. It is the reality of unaccompanied children because of restrictive borders migration legislations, or the necessity to escape from war, finding a way to survive crossing borders. In the last months, what we saw were children crying because dislocated from their parents, and in case also of European migration in Europe, abused children who arrived alone to Italy after dangerous journeys through the Mediterranean Sea. As Hannah Arendt wrote, storytelling reveals meaning without committing the error of defining it. So, the first case, the lack of a mother. One of the main issues that can be raised in Frankenstein novel concerns the question of natality. In Human Condition, it was written in 1958, so 7 years after the book on totalitarianism, and Hannah Arendt in 1958 was became a US citizen, so was no longer a stateless citizen. Arendt relates natalities to freedom and acting. She argued that the new beginning inherent in birth can make itself felt in the world only because the newcomer possesses the capacity of beginning something anew, that is, of acting. Yet Arendt does not intend natality in a biological sense, but in a political, social manner. If it's the case, what could it mean for Frankenstein when his liberty of creation contradicts the effect of his action and limits the agency of the mechanically created creature as natura naturata, different from natura naturans, but the creature is, as we heard before, with the different species, is real, a real human being. In the vindication of the rights of women, Shelley's mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, argued that liberty is the mother of virtue, yet an absolute liberty punishes the creator, say Wollstonecraft. And he mentioned actually that liberty might lead us with blind zeal to usurp the character of omnipotence. It's clear that is a reference of then her daughter to the fact that there was an abuse of liberty. And is what, said Victor, liberty, however, has been a useless gift for me. So, what does it mean, liberty? What is the link between liberty and birth, natality, when the creation does not have, didn't happen in a socio-political space, but in an experimental dominion, in the lack of a maternal body and the deprivation of a newborn? This question brings me to another issue. Did Mary Shelley transfigured literally the liberty to be born with the grief for the lack of her mother? For her, natality, for Shelley, was associated to a premature interruption and psychophysical deprivation because of the lacking contact with her mother. The daughter, Mary, who was the cause of her mother's death and who lived longer than her own children, became a resilient survivor who, all over her life, tried to re-elaborate creatively the sense of mourning and abandonment she felt, employing the power of writing for understanding, also in an ambivalent way, the viewpoint of both victims and perpetrators. Namely, Mary was an orphan who introduced a perspective of children as well as of suffering, marginalized and disabled individuals, elderly and children, changing first-person narratives with multiple identities. The dystopic image that Mary Shelley introduces is that of a creature represented as a so-called monster. But what does she mean for monster? I mean that there is a semantic shift in respect to the significance that this term had previously. Monstrum, monster comes from monstrum, is a neutral word, Latin word, that relates to the verb monere, which means warning, and refers to a divine sign, a portent, a prodigy. It is a phenomenological manifestation and the sudden appearance of something extraordinary which violates nature. Yet, the sense of wonder can turn into a nefarious feeling that generates both hope and fear. Shelley's criticism, I think, that is not only based on a religious argument and the hubris of a man who wanted to compete with God, but on a secular and gender disappointment toward an apparently free action which was not able to produce a real birth and natality and ended with the abandonment and lack of care. And it's also the reason, I think, why Victor couldn't give a proper name to the creature. He remains listed as the creature. Only human being born, I think, from a woman can have an individual name. Male reproduction continues to remain counterintuitive, as was in the case of the birth of Athena from the head of his father Zeus, who had swollen his daughter's mother, Metis. So it's all contributive, this kind of myth. Like in Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, each, Victor and his creature, become reciprocally master and slave. Yet all children pretend not to be abhorred by their parents or creators, provoking marginalization. Some quotation: "No father had watched my infant days, no mother had blessed me with smiles and caresses. Why do I live?" And then he ends also saying, "Even now my blood boils at the recollection of this injustice." So the sense of injustice. Mary Shelley adds the strength to a triple form of natality: the potential to be born, the frustrating potential to procreate biologically, and the intellectual freedom to create both Victor and the creature, as she narrates when she explains the genealogy of the novel, talking about the power of invention. So he always presented also character with double faces and ambivalence, as human beings are. Also, and so is the power, also the novel, also her mother, Wollstonecraft said, wrote in the book on Vindication of the Rights of Women, that novels contribute to increase the prejudices toward a supposed women's weakness. But Mary showed that was not the case. Second form of abandoned children, the marginalization of illegitimate and disabled children. One of the reasons that tradition induced the abandon of children was because illegitimate, that is, born outside a marriage, or because disabled. The creature was both. It did not have any name, that is, social identity and political citizenship, stateless, because experimentally born by a man, and because he was physically disabled. When I read for the first time this novel while attending the high school, I was impressed but also confused. I had approached the text, in fact, having in mind the stereotypical image that movies and pictures were reproducing of the so-called monster, who was gigantic, violent, adult, and short-minded. Attending classical liceo classico, I was studying Latin and ancient Greek, struggling with difficult translations, so that I was quite puzzled when I read, I quote, "Fortunately, the book were written in the language, the element of which I had acquired as a cottage. They consisted: Paradise Lost, a volume of Plutarch's Lives, which was quite scary for us, and The Sorrow or Werther." So they said, continue, I study and exercise my mind upon these histories while my friends were employed in their ordinary occupation. So it means that there were works in English, Latin, Greek, and German. So very impressed. So this fact helped me to make clear that against enduring stereotypes, physical disabilities does not interfere with cognitive intelligence. Yet cognitive rationality is not identical to emotional intelligence, as Martha Nussbaum said. Abandoned children cannot have necessarily a block of both physical and mental development, but without any doubt, they experience a repression of emotions that can lead to violent reaction, depression, self-harm, lack of self-recognition, and even to asociality and criminal actions. I worked also in a project in Kenya with the former street children, and I was told that when they were on street, either they did not use a personal name, they were without name, or forgot invented a new name, different from their original one, removing their natality. I also noticed in my research, because I work on domestic violence, on traumatized children, the so-called witness child, due to intrafamilial violence, but also hearing the testimonies of children born during the genocides at the end of the 20th century, Bosnia and Rwanda, that they still have post-traumatic syndrome, which avoids them to have a flourishing life. The creature was a talented individual, able to speak and to communicate, well-educated, able to communicate, but split between a cognitive ability and emotional deprivation, so that violence was a reactive propulsion towards suffered aggressions. Another case of, I said before, about abandoned children is a case of illegitimacy. They were punished, or they are still punished, without having any blame because bastard. Only in recent years, all children, legitimate or legitimate, we say figli naturali in Italian, they are recognized as the other children. The first woman who posed publicly this question was the revolutionary Girondist Olympe de Gouges, who was condemned to guillotine in 1793. She was the author of the Déclaration des droits de la femme et la citoyenne, presented to the National Assembly in 1791. She was born to a petit bourgeois family, but she believed that she was an illegitimate daughter of an aristocratic who rejected her claims, and this explained her ardent defense, passionate of the rights of illegitimate children. In the declaration, so she added a very interesting phrase in Article 11 of the Declaration of the Rights of the Man. She integrated in this way: the free communication of thought and opinion is one of the most precious rights of women, since that liberty assumes recognition of children by their fathers. Any female citizen thus may say freely, I am the mother of a child which belongs to you, without being forced by barbarous prejudice to hide the truth. So very courageous, but she was sent to the guillotine. The creature was an illegitimate, non-registered son with no mother, a mother could say, this is my creature. Third case, forced unaccompanied children, which is a hard case of our day. The problem of unaccompanied children due to migration has increased over years. Also the international and domestic conventions and legislation, and we have also European convention in terms of Council of Europe, aimed at protecting children. Yet children have become subjected to multiple forms of abuse and exploitation, mainly when victims of trafficking human beings. We have two important conventions. One was the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, issued in 1989, and we in Europe we have also the Convention on the Protection of Children Against Sexual Exploitation, Sexual Abuse, issued by the Council of Europe in 2007 because of the increasing sexual abuse. The creature was a fearing, unaccompanied child in the guise of a gigantic adult. In the last, and this is a problem because I want to put this question, in the last years, so we have in Europe and in Italy an increasing number of unaccompanied children because they are moving due to forced economic and environment migration. It is really the worst humanitarian crisis in the Mediterranean area after World War II. From the legal point of view, unaccompanied minors are considered boys and girls under 18 years old who arrive alone without parents in host countries. The reasons are various. They are orphans, they are former soldier children. They decide to undertake a possible way of survival, escaping from wars and misery, in many cases in accordance with their families. It was a case also of to escape from the Taliban in Afghanistan, and women and mothers leave in Pakistan their children because the only way to survive. So, the fictional creature can thus represent metaphorically and allegorically unaccompanied minor migrants who, once abandoned, can violently react to experience traumas and the difficulties they encounter when they are left without any protection and care. And is augmenting also the case of trafficking in organs. And we are really very much scaring. They are stateless children. These children are stateless before becoming citizens with political rights. Two present cases, as I mentioned at the beginning, can be taken as example: more restrictive borders policy in America, thank you, and in Europe, also with different reasons. One is American, and you know very well, because the New York Times reported that in April more than 700 children aside from their parents during the previous 6 months, and more 100 were under the age of 4. And there are also the problem, as we have also in Italy, of the lost track, in this case a number in the US, 1,500 immigrant children. And they want to quote also what a journalist wrote: "Do we not worry that the effect of this trauma can continue to damage these children for the rest of their life? Do we believe that these children are less valuable, less precious, less human than Ivanka Trump and Jared Kushner's 3-year-old son?" The question revokes ongoing process of dehumanization, where children are divided, they have become animals, because you can kill human beings when there is dehumanization, then no longer seen, recognized human beings. Children are divided into different human species, having a different value, and this is very scary. This violation of basic human rights, the lack of protection to our refugees, and the deprivation of care for children turn into form of torture. And I think that the UN Convention on Torture has to be expanded because of the trafficking, while it's very much restricted nowadays. But there are also things about missed people, and this is a problem of people. We, in Europe and in Italy, it's really a huge problem. As you know, the European Mediterranean Sea has become the deadliest border in the world. From 2014 to nowadays, more than 15,000 migrants have died at sea, and I'm working with a forensic doctor, working on the DNA, just to give an identity to these people. 1 minute, concluding, in Italy, the problem, we have a lot of missed children. Because during the last 5 months, we had between Greece, Italy, Spain, and Cyprus 45,000 migrants, and the problem is that remains high percentage of missed minors. From 2014 to 2017, 64,000 unaccompanied minors have arrived in Italy, but only 18,000 are still living in Italy, while 46,000 children, minors, are missed. And there is also a group working on that called Missing Children Europe. So we have a law, a good law in Italy called Provisions on Measures to Protect Unaccompanied Foreign Minors, with also tutors, issued in 2017, but is not enough, unfortunately. The hope is that unaccompanied children can return to their family in countries in peace and prosperous, or can find in the host countries a life they could not have in their native state. I conclude with a story telling, with a fairy tale. It's a story of Little Town by Charles Perrault. And you remember that the parents had to leave their 7 children, male children, because of the misery, and because the mother said, however, having considered what a grief it would be for her to see them perish with hunger, she at least consented to leave in the hood their children, and went to bed in tears. This fairy tale that expressed the fear of abandon that any child has, and also we as adults have, and that we would hear, and I hope that you would hear this story only because it's no longer true. Yet the stories of abandoned, vulnerable children continue to be very much real, and not only a matter of fantastic imaginary. This is the reason why the creature continues to remember the fact that we have to avoid injustice and to be responsible. Thank you.
So we have about 17 minutes for questions from the audience, so please raise your hand, and we have all the mics here, so I will send one to the audience. Let's start with David.
Thank you very much. It seems to me that the theme running, well, it's obvious that the theme running through those papers was about hospitality. And this is really just a kind of footnote to that. It first occurred to me during an earlier paper today, where the term xenotransplantation was used. And I was thinking about the Greek root, xenos, which later on came to mean the foreigner or the stranger, but originally didn't mean that. Xenos was the Greek root for hospitality. I don't think Dellarosa makes that point when he's talking about the Latinate derivations. And you'll recall that the great sin against the Greek gods was a failure of hospitality. And the gods, of course, were always coming down to earth to test us humans on whether we were going to be hospitable or not. So, and we normally failed that test. And so the term xenophobia, not that it was coined in those days anyway, but would seem to mean something less like fear of the foreigner than fear of the danger of offering hospitality. I think that's really part of what we're all talking about. And that's, of course, what Frankenstein is also talking about. That was my only point, really, although it did occur to me that I think that in one of the early parts of the myth cycle associated with Prometheus, and it's odd that so far in this conference, as far as I know, we haven't mentioned Prometheus, but I think that one of the early parts of that myth cycle concerning Prometheus and his brother Epimetheus, there is indeed an issue of hospitality. But I can't quite get it straight in my mind. It might have to do with Pandora, and it might be reverse hospitality, the danger of offering hospitality. I'm not quite sure. Perhaps somebody can help me out on that. Just a footnote.
Can I answer? Because of my classic studies. The problem of hospitality is present in the Bible, in Greece, and in Roman. I mean, the issue of hostes, hospitality, is because of the translation, the hospice became also hostis. That is, there is a dialectical meaning of the guest, but also the enemy. Yeah. So it's very anthropological, this dialectical meaning, so that the problem is when there is no longer the hospitality, but the hostess became the enemy. So this was the shift in the meaning in Latin. Then in Greece, it's very clear that you know that the temple, Greek temple, they are open because it's a space where there are sacred space. When you go in, the divinity touch you. So it means that if you go into this sacred space, nobody can touch you, take you. So it's the right of asylum. That was then also in other culture. And then in the Bible, you know that there was the seven cities of hospitality. So it was the fact that you could go to these cities and to be protected until when we are not judged. So there is in all in Western culture different kinds to talk about the right of asylum and the right to be protected until when we will be not judged and so on. And so it has been transformed also, for instance, in literature, in the case of Dante, the Unaccompanied, and in all the literature, but is present in different forms in Western culture over centuries.
Yes.
Thank you. Over here.
Okay, I think that mainly is a question for Franca and Mary. I have a bit of question in terms of I'm not clear what you make of the right of the working class at the time, because now let's start from what David pointed out and from your answer, the right to be protected and the right of asylum. Now that was a very strong reality we can see in Shakespeare, no? and on, until the Industrial Revolution. Because there is a key concept that came across, there was property. And property opened a terrible gap between who owned the right to property and actually had property, and the people without property. Not by chance, exactly at the time, I mean, few decades before Mary Shelley's, and during Mary Shelley's time, the laws had increase punishment for the property transgressors.
Okay.
And now I wonder, I often ask myself why the monster burned the cottage rather than, I don't know, doing something physical. Because it was a property, was a basic property, of the Dellarosa. And the worst offense that you could betray, you could bestow, on people, especially if this was affected by people like the Luddites, or do you say Luddites?
Yes.
Okay. Who smashed, not by chance, the industrial machine, and who were defended by Byron in two out of the 3 speeches he delivered at the House of Lords. So I don't think you can. That would another. If you think about Wordsworth, Dorothy, and William talking about the vagrants, the people who were homeless, and how were people who brought disconcern, fear, worries, and of course were all people who had to live their homes and fulfilled because of the Industrial Revolution. Now we are in the 4th Industrial Revolution. It's called Industry 4.0, something like that. So, and all the incredible, terrible waves of migrants who come to the West, and to whom we can't respond. We are unable to respond. Are they so much dissimilar? So, from those who were, circulating without a home, without a property, in the streets, in the field, in the wood of the time, of Mercial's time.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, yeah, too long.
Would you like to answer?
Okay.
The mic is in front of you.
This is a microphone.
I think that's a very interesting observation that property is involved, and I think historicizing Frankenstein, as you suggested, is tremendously relevant. What I would also like to pick up in what you said is that we're facing another manifestation of this. I was very interested to see that Angela Merkel, trying to come to terms with the internal political stresses of having, in effect, an open border, has developed 4 possible ways of dealing with this. One is to restrict immigration and under pressure from the right, but the other is also to invest in Africa. And of course, that's, many migrants are coming because of violence and persecution, but also many are coming because there's no way to subsist. They don't have property, they don't have economic livelihood. So your point is very acute, I think, that we're looking at a situation where the West seems prosperous, but also where those in the West who have not experienced the increase in income or in the better standard of living are in fact those who are voting into power, right-wing politicians who don't want immigration. We see that in America, we see that in England, we see that in people who are against the European Common Market, against the EU, are people who feel that it has deprived them of something, though I think that's a misunderstanding myself. But I think you're right to throw economics into the mix, of course. And one of the problems is that in order to claim asylum, you have to claim persecution, and from time immemorial, people have migrated economically Ireland would be a very good case of that during the Industrial Revolution, when their labour was needed, but it was also feared that they took low wages and therefore would displace British workers. I mean, it is, you know, the same all over again historically. So, if that's your point, yes.
So I don't think that the two, thanks in fact for your observation again, I don't think that the two, let's say, levels are necessarily in contrast. Because, I mean, going back for a moment to the, let's say, to the, let's say, microcosm of the novel. I mean, yes, it's a piece of property that the creature destroys, but it's also a symbolic place. It's the oikos, it's a home in which he had invested also emotionally, and this is in turn it was the dwelling of a marginalized, let's say, micro community, that is the Lacey family, with respect to the let's say slightly wider community. And this is true to the point that they live after the, let's say, the shocking discovery. So I mean that is one level of symbolic reading that I think I mean the novel asks. On the other hand, yes, the economic element. You mentioned the rights of the working classes, and I mean the figure of the creature embraces all this as well. I mean the readings in the direction of let's say class-oriented rather than race-oriented is there. Of course, I don't know if this in some way.
May I answer?
Yes,
yes, right. What she said about the oikos, because the cottage was a space to be recognized a full human being. That is also the refugees want to be recognized again, because when they lose their citizenship, they are stateless. Nobody will care them. So this was a space of sociability, of community. And so he had to destroy, because he was a sort of traveler, because he was he needed a refuge. This refuge was no longer possible. We have not to forget the right to asylum was anthropologically found in the Western tradition, but the UN was only signed in 1951 and was related also only to people persecuted because of the Shoah. Only in 1967, with the protocol, was expanded to all political refugees. And nowadays, the difference between economic or environmental migrants collides with the fact that the asylum right is addressed only to political, but it's not to children, because children could, for any reason they must have the right of asylum. So it's very complex.
Thank you very much.
So one other theme that was across these papers is the limits of the modern human and who is killable. And we've got all sorts of resources for thinking about this, whether it's Arendt and thinking about the state and sovereignty, or more recent work, Alexander Rielhe, talking about habeas viscus, how racializing assemblages divide up humans between fully human, protected by the law, quasi or subhuman, and therefore killable. And I really like this image as the backdrop for this conversation. And want to presence again, 20 years ago today, the 157 people who were dumped in the ocean of Biak. And I think this speaks directly to what you were just saying, not just about the migrants, but about these economic assemblages, how sovereignty in the current moment is inherently compromised by whether it's commodity chains or plantation economies. And I wonder if there's a way to theorize the limits of the modern human within these relations of economic interdependency that sustain privilege and inequality in these global relations.
Thank you. You want to answer? Should we collect
As a way to
another
theorize
couple?
that. I wish.
We have to reform the right of asylum, and because what is different is that the right of asylum is related to international UN convention, but not the rights of migration, economic migration, because it depends from national legislation. So in Europe, we do not have a common legislation for economic migrants. And the reason why also different European states react in a very different way, Italy in a way, Germany in a way, and because of the crisis of the European Union.
Marina, I mean, I remember I came across. I came.
No, it's a switch.
Where's that? Okay. I came across an article on. On migration theory.
Yeah.
That was about migration without borders.
Yeah. Okay.
Which
it's as a perspective of cosmopolitanism.
Exactly.
But cosmopolitan should be integrated into domestic laws. Otherwise,
which is always
it's Kant. Yeah.
Which is always.
Please.
Hi. Thank you for. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you for this very important panel. It occurred to me in listening to your papers that the creature has a kind of solution to the lack of hospitality, and that is to go to South America.
Colonialist.
Right.
So I wonder what you think of that respect. I think that, that request, sorry. I think that your argument plays out in Victor's response to the creature. He imagines South America as a kind of Arendtian nowhere, right? It's a place of wild beasts, and it's a place of exile too. And he can't imagine, the creature not wanting to come back from this space of exile. And so I just wonder how you imagine Mary Shelley imagining that request, how you imagine the creature imagining that request.
It's a fascinating question,
It's
isn't it? Yes.
When was Humboldt published?
When
was Humboldt's book on South America published? Yeah. It's a fascinating question, and I can't answer it because I can't remember when Humboldt was published, but I do think that idea, of course, it's the proto-colonial idea. You take your younger sons and send them off to South America or Africa or wherever. And so, we should not expect Mary Shelley's book to be without internal contradictions and problems, and I think that using it as an instrument to think with, in a way is possible, but not only because of its capaciousness, its transferability, but because it does have these contradictions, and we can ask those. I don't think it makes a particular difference to me that the book proposes something that you can say, or that the being proposes something that you can say is highly problematic, whether people there were, and probably decimated by European arrivals, as we know subsequently. But the question is what you're using this book for, and we've all used it to think with, to think different problems. Some of them are old problems that have gone on for as long as we've been human. Some of them are new problems that have come into focus because of our circumstances in the 21st century, and I think that's the best answer I can give you. But yeah, that's it.
Okay. I was thinking that perhaps, if I may, I would try to imagine what the creature would feel, in the sense that the creature has listened to the fate of Americans, listening to the stories told to Safi, and this might imply a sort of. I just wonder, knowing the little of we know about the creature, a sort of sympathetic attitude towards another category of oppressed people, or I don't know if
this makes any sense, but
Mm.
that's what
Yeah.
the
I mean, the final where it's going to the
yes.
No, I see
Why
metaphorical-
did it we did
Yeah, I
choose
think that there is
South
it's
America?
very interesting the geography environment that Shelley developed so everywhere. But I see the final scene also not only in terms of exotic, but because was a frozen human being, because the emotion where after the violence he suffered and he did was a kind of the feeling of the soul, was a frozen soul. And this was the scene I saw at the beginning in the ice and so on. So it was my, I mean, the final, and but I have to think about it.
We have one last question.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Rosie Colombo and I'm of Sapienza, University of Rome. My comment more than a question is really on this issue of hospitality. While you were talking about it, the three of you, the two of you. I was thinking of the Odyssey and also of the Iliad. Ulysses, when he landed into the Phaeacia, I'm afraid I don't know the word in English, that land, obtained a hospitality and more than that by telling a story. And the same with Aeneas. When he got to Carthage, he got hospitality by telling a story. And of course he got more than hospitality, both of them. He also got lovers. My impression, or my question, or my comment, I don't know what you call it, is whether for Mary Shelley, who at that time, if I'm not mistaken, was reading with, together with Percy, a lot of Greek literature. The idea of telling a story might be a mediation that she used in order to transmit this message of hospitality to the readers, to the world.
Let me perhaps respond indirectly. I think you're absolutely right. Telling stories has always been a way to make yourself to enable yourself to become part of a community. Whether what Mary Shelley's intention was, I don't know. But I think it's interesting that if you can't tell a story nowadays, it counts in certain ways. You don't get a welcome. And the children who have been separated from their parents in America often have just a phone number. They don't speak the language. There's no way for them to tell their story or even get reunited with their parents except through the use of DNA. We're suddenly seeing DNA as the last resort way to unite children and they're separated from their parents. So yes, I think story is almost synonymous with persuasion, rhetoric, and democracy in some ways. But as we know, the story is also mediated through the law, and I think part of what I was talking about was it has to be a certain kind of story. There's a policing of stories in order to pass not the imaginative bar, but the bar of the law. So the trafficked women, for instance, have to have their stories corrected, so it has a certain form. So storytelling is not a free art, as it were. It is subject to certain kinds of constraint when what you're trying to do is meet a legal criteria. And of course, Greek hospitality was a code of a different kind, of social code of a different kind. And I think the problem is now that we're trying to negotiate different understandings of hospitality when we ask people, demand of people who they are, where they've come from, etc., etc. What Mary Shelley was doing, well, many things, too many. I mean, that's what we've learned in these few days, that the novel is enormously capacious in terms of what the story it may be telling us about her own times or about today.
Perhaps I wasn't quite correct when I'm telling a story in a sense. my comment was mainly about the value of literature.
I mean, the entire structure, the structure of the novel.
As an instrument of creating a bridge between ourselves and the other.
Right.
This is what I really wanted to get to.
Yeah.
And the novel itself, I mean, the structure is, revolves around a continuous exchange and a chain of storytelling, after all. And I'm not sure. I think I must have read that. Were they reading also the Arabian Nights Entertainment at the time? I think so. And that is another element that is because obviously
girl.
exactly right exactly that's very true. Yeah. And so that adds to the, let's say, to the power of storytelling as being in at work.
It's true that telling stories is a matter of also divertissement, entertainment, but in my case, in my research, traumatized people do not tell their stories as a children or survivor to the Holocaust because of the pain, but only they tell the story in two cases. One is a need to the asylum, being an asylum seeker to have the permission to stay, or second, when they decide to be witnesses and to say what's happened to them because they don't want any longer that it could happen. But they don't tell. They tell because there is the syndrome of the survivor. Because, as Primo Levi said, you are not happy to have been survived to your beloved, to your friends, and so on. They only do it because they don't want that could happen again. So it's, it's very complex issue.
Thank you very much for everybody.